There we go. How's that? Awesome. All right, welcome everybody. All right, so we're pleased to co-host this event today with Climate Generation, a longtime partner of the Institute on the Environment. I have a little intro script before I hand it off here to kick off the program. Today's event will provide reflections on COP23, which recently took place in Bonn, Germany. This is the International Climate Conference. We have an incredible panel of Minnesotans who attended the negotiations, and I believe they're going to be introductions in a moment, so I'll save you that surprise in just a second. A little over 25,000 people attended the climate talks in Bonn, including everyone from world leaders to legislators to advocates and private citizens from across the globe. And each year these negotiations continue to work on strengthening the global response to climate change. But this year specifically focused on writing and strategizing the official rule book for the Paris Agreement forged in 2015. I'd like to introduce Janet Brown, Associate Director of Climate Generation, who will kick off the program and tell you a little bit more about our speakers today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Todd. Appreciate it. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here this afternoon for Minnesota Reflections Bonn Climate Summit. Thank you to the Institute on the Environment for your long partnership and for co-hosting this afternoon. Welcome to those joining virtually. And of course, thank you to our distinguished panel for joining us. Climate Generation, a Will Steger legacy, is an independent nonprofit based in Minnesota with a mission to empower individuals and their communities to engage in solutions to climate change. We strategically work with educators, youth, the public, and decision makers for action on climate change. Climate Generation has been leading delegations to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Conference of the Parties, better known by its abbreviation COP, since 2009. We are proud of our delegation this year, which crossed many sectors from education, government, youth, indigenous communities, and philanthropy. COPs are annual meetings that bring together the international community to check in on and ideally commit to furthering progress and action on climate change, which poses the largest threat to humanity. Having co-led a delegation in 2015 to COP21 in Paris with Kristen Poppleton, our Director of Programs, and 10 educators from across the country, I can tell you that attending COP is an intense and life-altering experience. It was so powerful to see the world community come together and finally sign on to an international climate agreement with 197 countries. As you are all likely aware, the President has indicated his intent to withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement. I'm sure you'll hear from our panel today on how strange it felt to be an American at COP this year and the important and vocal presence of the United States and cities had at the conference, from the U.S. Climate Alliance, the We're Still In campaign, and the People's Climate Movement. Today's panel reflects the diversity of sectors and voices that is taking action on climate change, and is a subset of over 30 individuals from Minnesota that attended COP23 to demonstrate the strong partnerships and leadership that is happening here in our state. We're so grateful for the work that they did representing Minnesota and their willingness to share and reflect on their experience here today. I'd like to introduce our panel, and each will share a 5-minute reflection. During the reflections, please record any questions. For those of you in the room, you have cards and pencils on your chairs. If you need one, feel free to raise your hand and we'll get one to you. For those online, there is a live chat box that you can pose questions in, and we'll be sure to get to those as well. If you'd like to have one of our panelists specifically answer a question, just put their name next to it so that we can indicate that. So I'd first like to introduce Ellen Anderson. Ellen Anderson is the director of the University of Minnesota's Energy Transition Lab. The lab leverages university expertise in law, policy, and other disciplines in partnership with the public, private, community, and nonprofit sectors to help steer our energy system to the future. From 2012 to 2014, Anderson was senior advisor on energy and environment to Governor Mark Dayton and assisted the State Environmental Quality Board. From 2011 to 2012, she was chair of the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. Anderson served in the Minnesota Senate from 1993 to 2011. Her signature legislation includes the Renewable Energy Standard, the Next Generation Energy Act, and many other energy consumer protection, economic justice, and civil rights laws. Anderson holds a BA from Carleton College and a JD cum laude from University of Minnesota Law School. As an associate adjunct faculty, she teaches law and renewable energy courses and received dozens of awards for her leadership, as she should. So I'm going to turn it over to Ellen Anderson for your reflection.
All right, thank you so much, Janet. Is my mic on properly?
No, one more here. Oh, it's still not going on.
Yeah, it's not going to be green.
It doesn't green? Oh, okay.
It's correct. I'm good to go. Thank you so
Great.
much. Thank you
Great.
for the kind introduction. And I want to welcome everyone here to I&E as well. Thank you, Todd. This is my home at the University of Minnesota, and I'm honored to be part of the I&E community. And I was really honored to be a delegate to the COP23 in Bonn, Germany. And it was an interesting experience, in particular this year, wearing two hats as an official observer from the University of Minnesota and part of our observer delegation status that the UN gives research institutions like universities. And the other hat I was wearing was as a delegate with Climate Generation. And so it was opened a lot of doors and a lot of connections with the civil society and NGO communities around the world that participate in these COP meetings. So I'm going to just reflect on a few of those examples in my time there. And it's great to see some of the other members of our delegation that are here. Cheryl, some students from Humphrey, one of my students from last year when we went to Marrakesh. It's really good to have you here. So I want to talk first about my goals. Why did I go? As a University of Minnesota person and someone who works on energy transition, I felt that it was important to be there to talk about what is really happening in Minnesota and in the United States, knowing that the US presence would be minimal at best, I guess I should say, and probably contrary, in my opinion, to the views of many Americans. So part of what I wanted to do was tell the story of the work that we've done in Minnesota to advance a clean energy transition in a way that's been very positive. It's been good for our state. It's created a lot of jobs, improved our air quality, and shown that you can reduce carbon at a low price in a way that still maintains a reliable electricity system and keeps the lights on. I even sang the praises of Xcel Energy in Bonn, Germany, talking about their goals to, by 2030, to be an 85% carbon-free utility and to be producing over 60% renewable electricity. So I think those stories are important to tell, and I think the other stories were more broadly about where the United States is on issues of clean energy and climate change, beyond the perspective that you hear from Washington, D.C. So I was lucky to have the opportunity to participate in a press conference, and this was kind of the NGO side of things, where we were part of the U.S. People's Climate Delegation, and that was kind of an organic group that sprung up in preparation for the COP23 to bring together leaders from around the United States at the very grassroots level, talking about what needs to be done and what progress is being made with or without the participation of the federal government. And so I think that was the biggest theme to me of the COP coming as an American, was that, and I even brought my sticker, we are still in, and you'll hear more about that from Stephanie and others about the role that was played by a lot of Americans in demonstrating leadership at the local, state, and regional level and in communities to advance progress on climate change. So in the press conference, I was joined by lots of NGO leaders from around the United States who represented indigenous communities and youth and grassroots activist organizations. And then I was there as kind of the policy person talking about the role that policy can play and to tell that story of Minnesota as well as that story of the United States, that despite everything that's happening with the president wanting to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, that we are making progress and we're actually more or less on track to meet those clean power plant targets, which is the United States' main commitment under the Paris Agreement. So I want to mention Al Gore, whose talk I was fortunate enough to be at, and a group of our delegation snagged the front row. Thank you for those who got there first. And I got to shake Al Gore's hand, and he gave a really fantastic talk, which kind of I think, is an overview similar to the films that he's done on climate change that really are very factual and scientifically based. And so he spent a lot of time really going through the really dire and kind of depressing realities of what's going on around the world in terms of trends on our changing climate and impacts that are already having an impact on people around the world. And he really emphasized that people thing, that it's really, that this is not just sort of an abstract environmental cause to save the planet, that this is about saving the home that we all live in and share, and the ability for us to have any kind of reasonable and decent quality of life going into future generations is what's at stake. And so that was very sobering, but he also gave us a lot of hope, and I think that sort of bifurcated theme was very much what I felt throughout my entire time there, that there's a great deal of progress being made, that there are thousands and thousands of people, both in the United States and around the world, that are very committed to advancing reductions in carbon emissions and meeting the Paris climate goals and beyond, but that there's a sense of very strong urgency. I could keep going on, but have I used up 5 minutes?
Yeah, I think,
That's what
I
thought.
think I think that's a great overview, so I appreciate you doing that. So wonderful. And are we okay on sound, or is it, do we need to hold it a little bit?
How you do this one? This one. Please do try to hold them up.
Sorry.
Great. Thank you, Ellen. I would next like to introduce Stephanie Zawistowski, who is the Senior Policy Advisor for Governor Mark Dayton and Lieutenant Governor Tina Smith. In this role, she serves as the lead advisor on energy and environmental issues. Stephanie has over 10 years of experience in a variety of roles in energy and climate policy and environmental sustainability in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. Stephanie has a BA from the University of Chicago and an MBA from the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota. A native of northwestern Minnesota, Stephanie lives in Minneapolis with her husband and 2 daughters. Welcome, Stephanie. Thanks for your reflection.
Thanks, Janet, and thank you everyone for having us here today to the Institute on Environment and to Climate Generation. I was not an official climate generation delegate per se, but had the wonderful chance to meet almost everyone, I think, in the delegation just prior to leaving for Bonn. They came to meet with Lieutenant Governor Tina Smith to deliver a message, or basically to ask what messages she would want to have delivered on behalf of the Dayton administration to the climate talks in Bonn. And in the last few weeks, right before the conference, I was able to be able to go myself. Got the okay to go ahead and represent Governor Dayton and Lieutenant Governor Smith there. It was a phenomenal opportunity. I've attended one other COP as part of an NGO that I was working for in 2008. It was in Poznan, Poland, and the difference between that COP, which was right after President Obama got elected, and this COP, after the first year of the Trump administration, was a stark difference. Talking with people from around the world, there was incredible hope in 2008 that, the Americans have maybe they'll finally come to the table again, after, years and years of not wanting to participate and just, saying, okay, we're going to make progress on our own way, but, we won't be bound by any sort of global agreement. And then, we elect a president in 2008 that seems to usher in a change of heart. We elected another president that ushered in a different change of heart, but that prompted people like myself and others from representing other states to attend COP23 in Bonn to represent We Are Still In, to represent the U.S. Climate Alliance, a group of states, including Minnesota, of about 15 states, that have demonstrated that those governors are still committed to the goals of the Paris Agreement and are still going to work toward making progress on those goals and sharing best practices amongst states on how we can work together to keep, not only just keep on the path, but to do our part to try to see how we can go above and beyond while we seem to have stagnation in Washington, D.C. So that was the purpose of why I, along with a delegation of, I would say about 10 other states, attended the climate talks. And it was a bipartisan group of state representatives that were there. There were representatives from Maryland and Massachusetts that have Republican governors. There were representatives from Colorado and Hawaii. And of course Minnesota, so not just your typical sort of East and West Coast dominated conversation about what states are doing on climate change. Specifically in talking about what Minnesota is doing, I was there to deliver a strong message on clean energy jobs. In Minnesota, the clean energy policies that Ellen referenced, that she championed and helped pass when she was in the legislature, those have been responsible for the creation of over 57,000 jobs in clean energy and energy efficiency in Minnesota. It's an incredible job creating engine within the state. We are one of the leaders in job creation and in the development of new patents and energy efficiency work and renewable energy across the nation, and we don't want to cede that leadership position, certainly to other states and to other countries around the world, as they are working to try to catch up and to move faster and farther than ever before. And so that's really what the main purpose that I was there was to tell the story about a Midwestern state that has been working on for well over the past 10 years, very earnestly and wholeheartedly in trying to make progress on clean energy development and energy efficiency advances. And we've been very successful as far as making sure that we're hitting our goals for renewable energy. We are on track to easily surpass those goals that are in statute well before the 2025 goal that was set in 2007. So Governor Dayton is looking to move beyond that and talking about setting a renewable energy standard of 50% by the year 2030, which I think is well within reach, and what we are working on, what we've been working on in the last legislative session, and what will continue to deliver that message moving forward in the 2018 legislative session. So other than that, I think it was a really valuable experience for me to talk with my counterparts in other states about the challenges that they face, the successes that they've seen, and to get some ideas of how we can partner, between states on issues that we find, are a common thread between us. It certainly was really helpful to, it's the irony that you have to go, across an ocean to build relationships is kind of funny, but it's really true. You have a bonding experience with the people that you get to know over the course of a week. I was there the second week, and when a number of there were 4 governors who attended the conference, as well as former Governor Schwarzenegger from California, also known as the Governator. I did have a sighting of him. So it was great to be a part of that experience and to strengthen those relationships and see what we can bring home to Minnesota and move forward during the rest of the Governor Dayton's term.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephanie. Appreciate that. I'd next like to introduce John Olsen. John Olsen is the Science Content Specialist for the Minnesota Department of Education. He works on science learning goals and instruction with teachers, schools, districts, and other state education leaders. John serves on the Board of Directors for the National Science Teachers Association as Director for Coordination and Supervision of Science Education. This work is primarily with science education leadership of school districts and states. In addition, he teaches science education and methods class for Metropolitan State University in St. Paul. Olsen taught physics and environmental science with St. Paul Public Schools in an urban setting and also served as the science coordinator for the district. In the early 70s and again in 2016, John served in Liberia with the U.S. Peace Corps as a rural teacher trainer. John also spent several years as the director of a youth camp on Lake Superior in Wisconsin and has led state representative for the development of the next generation science standards. John, thank you for joining us.
All right. Well, thank you for this great opportunity. Prior to my invitation a couple months ago, I had not paid close attention to what the COPs are and all these other acronyms that were going on. And so I didn't really know what to expect. I didn't know if there would be a carnival atmosphere with T-shirts and all kinds of other paraphernalia and all kinds of demonstrations going on and really active. But I found that it was a very business-like environment. People were very intense, very interested in what's going on. You know, the buildings are mostly, you know, temporary buildings with fabric and things like that. So there was not a lot of noise, and it just had that intensity of people gathering, talking about what they heard, and going off in their various areas. You know, I followed mostly kind of side events that were based on particular topics, and so what I found out about what was really going on in the negotiation was the opportunities at lunches to sort of, you know, catch somebody. So I would find out somebody who was one of the parties who was in part of the deliberation, and he would talk about how intense it was, how people would get angry, they'd stomp their feet, there'd be some crying. And so I really got the gathering that it really was something that people had a lot of concerns about. And the events that I went to, people also talked about what they were really hoping from it and what their perspective was. I tried to follow kind of two issues. One was education, obviously, and another was about what the perspective of less developed countries are in those areas. And with the education, I think I found there was a lot of optimism. There wasn't a lot of concrete sort of things that actually came out of it, but people expressed some of the things that were very exemplary kind of practices. In Germany, they are starting a series of, I think they have now 26, they call kind of climate action schools that they're working on, in which they're looking at the whole, what they call sort of the whole school approach, from facilities to structures of courses and things like that. And they are eventually hoping by 2025 that that movement kind of spreads across the country. We heard other kinds of train the trainer kind of models that are going on in other aspects. They also expressed the hope that, you know, educating our youth will be one of the real important tools towards working with climate change kinds of concerns. They said that kids are impatient. They don't wait for considering all the factors that are going on. They're quick to prod their parents to change their practices. They also sort of talked about the idea that we really need to help kids get an international perspective. Oftentimes as educators, we look at the nearest disaster and says that will hook our kids, and we'll be talking about those kinds of things with our kids, but kids need to have the perspective of long term about how we as part of a global society can play our part. The other issue that I followed was about the third world countries, and there was a lot of perspective of that. We are suffering the most, but we did the least to cause this problem. That really the people that are in the developed countries really have to step up and help to fund the kind of issues that are going on. They talked about adaptation. Apparently, prior to about 2001, that was a dirty word in the COP deliberations. They didn't want to feel that we are giving in by saying we're just going to adapt. But now people are asking beyond adaptation for loss and damage. What's it really doing to us? How can we deal with the people who are suffering the most? In West Africa, a third of the people live in the coastal areas of the population, and they are greatly suffering from the rise in sea level and increased storms, large variability in the weather, so that it's hard to predict when it's time to plant and not, because you don't know when the rainy season's going to come, and have those kind of things. So they're really pressing for people to sort of support that and fund some of those issues. Apparently, I can't remember which conference it was, but there was a promise of a $100 billion fund for less developed countries, and people are saying we're not seeing any of it. It's not really coming through. And so there's the big push on that, and also the feeling that people aren't really supporting that. one kind of impression that I kind of came away as sort of a concluding comment is that with the United States not being firmly from our government supporting it, there is a lot of energy in the United States to achieve the goals that we want to in terms of reducing greenhouse gases and those kind of things. That maybe will happen on its own. But without us taking our part of supporting the rest of the world, especially the less developed countries, they will continue to suffer more than if we were really heavily involved and were doing our share.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that perspective. I would next like to introduce Lee Curry. Lee Curry is a senior staff attorney at the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy and has served on the board of Climate Generation since 2010, most recently as chair. Lee is her legal experience includes practicing environmental law at a private law firm in Minneapolis, clerking for the Honorable Jill Flaskamp Halbrooks at the Minnesota Court of Appeals, and teaching legal writing at her alma mater. Lee graduated salutatorian from William Mitchell College of Law, has a Master's of Science in Conservation Biology from the University of Minnesota, and has a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Science and Biology from Tufts University. Lee regularly appears at the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission to advocate for economic solutions to fight climate change. Welcome, Lee. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Janet. And I'll just start off by also thanking Climate Generation for this opportunity. I was really excited to get to go to one of the COPs as a board member for Climate Generation. I definitely heard about the COPs, but didn't pay, as John said, super close attention to what they were about until I got the invitation. And it was a true honor to be able to go and represent Climate Generation and the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, where I practice at the nonprofit where I work. I had a couple goals going into Bonn. One was to really see how or if I could translate my work in Minnesota up into a regional, national, international level. As Janet mentioned, I spend most of my days at the Public Utilities Commission, which is the body that oversees the electricity sector in Minnesota and enforces things like our renewable energy standard. So when utilities come to the PUC with a plan for how they're going to generate electricity, I intervene with my partner organizations and say, you could do more wind, you can do more solar, you can do more energy efficiency, less coal, less natural gas. So that's sort of my day-to-day. What I hear back a lot from regulated utilities and the regulators is, well, we can't make that much of a difference. We're just Minnesota we're a drop in the bucket when you're talking about climate change. This is a global problem. The CO2 emissions from Minnesota are, not that big piece of the pie. And so I wanted to go to Bonn and see what's happening internationally and how can I bring that back and say, yeah, but we still need to do more, and here's why. Here's how it fits in the international scheme of things. Here's how what we're doing on the ground in Minnesota makes a difference worldwide. And my other goal was really, so that was sort of a learning goal. My other goal was forward-looking or outward-looking to bring the message to the rest of the world that we are there are boots on the ground in America, in the U.S., doing hard work to try to implement the Paris Agreement. And we'll keep doing that for the next 3 years, and then hopefully we can have a federal government who helps out from that level as well. And so I wanted to try to pass that message along. And with those two goals, I really did kind of split my time. One was to watch the international UNFCCC negotiations and see kind of what is happening on the international level and what are other countries doing. And then the other was spent sort of in the bubble, as we started calling it, which I'll talk a little bit about. But the UNFCCC negotiations were fascinating to watch, and it was hard, I think, to not be at the table. I wanted to be up there sort of negotiating, and it was hard to just be the observer status that we were. We were lucky to even have observer status, but I'd say my take-home message was that that it was full speed ahead from the other countries. It seemed like that there was not a lot of discussion or hand wringing about what do we do now that Trump has declared the U.S. might not be in the Paris Agreement. It was, how do we implement this? How do we get the guidebook written? How do we set the rules? How do we take care of developing countries? Not a lot of discussion about the U.S., so that was really fascinating. And then just every country, and even, within the U.S., every state is at its own level. And this idea that we all need to be waiting for others to catch up before we continue to move forward is simply not true. Everyone has to be doing the most that they possibly can, if we're going to solve this. And so if you are a country in Europe and you've already pledged to be off coal by 2020, that's still not enough. And what the U.S. is doing, what Minnesota is doing, is still not enough. Every state, every country has to be doing as much as possible. And then I'd say my takeaway from the idea that we're trying to tell the rest of the world that the U.S. is still in and that the states are doing their fair share, I'd say it was really powerful to see this coming together of all these U.S. actors. There was this tent, or the bubble, in between the two zones. So there was this official negotiating zone, and then about 1.5 miles, 2 miles away, there was the civil society zone. And in between those two, Michael Bloomberg and others had financed this temporary structure for the U.S. because the U.S. for the first time ever didn't have an official space in one of the official zones. And if anything, I think the announcement by Trump that he's going to try to withdraw from the Paris Agreement just galvanized people. I mean, I was there the first week with Ellen, and Cheryl's here today, and Jake, who was there as well, and Craig. And so the bubble didn't open until Thursday that first week, and so the first few days it wasn't a thing, and then it opened up, and there was just a ton of energy around that space, and all of us Americans, I think, were there with the same ideas. How do we make sure everyone knows we're still in? And we got our buttons to show it. So those were my big takeaways. We still need to be doing more, but there's a lot of energy around doing more, and that's exciting.
Great. Thank you, Lee. Appreciate that as well. I just want to remind you, if you have questions, please pass them into the middle aisle, and we'll have people collecting those. Again, if you're online, please feel free to put something in the live chat box, and we'll be sure to try to get that answered as well. So just while we're waiting for those collections, I thought maybe we could just start with a question. I will also just say that our delegation blogged every day, and we also have a number of webinars, and they were excellent. So it really felt like I was in Bonn with all of you joining. And so if you would like to see those reflections, you can go to climategen.org/COP23 and get a chance to see some of those great reflections. But I know, Stephanie, since you weren't officially part of our delegation, I just wanted to start with you and just say, how do you think your experience, I know you talked about the increase renewable energy standard to 50% by 2030, since we're already reaching those targets. I just wonder, what has your personal experience bringing back to the administration here? How do you see that being reflected and maybe played out in the next year? So.
Yeah, we, I think our political landscape in Minnesota is pretty reflective of the rest of the country. Governor Dayton has been, long a champion of, climate action. But we have a legislature where, unfortunately, the majorities that are in power, I think, tend to side with the current Trump administration. And so we've got some of that debate going on right now. But I don't think that certainly deters the governor's willingness and his feelings on trying to figure out how we can move forward, whether it, if we're still talking about how we can move something through the legislature, that's certainly an avenue that we'll continue to pursue. The governor, I think, is exploring what he could do through executive action through the last year. Last week, he rolled out a new executive order that updates some sustainability goals for our state government enterprise, which I think is a great start and a signal of things to come of what we can do. Certainly Minnesota is, the state of Minnesota is one of the largest employers in the state. And so, our footprint of buildings throughout the state, I think we can really make a difference in having really strong and measurable goals for making those buildings more sustainable, for greening our fleet, for pursuing, cleaner energy through energy contracts and things like that. And so, that's a lot of the work that, we are devoting energy to as a state enterprise, but we're certainly not going to leave the policy arena impacting the rest of the state, something, totally untouched during the remainder of the legislative session and the remainder of the governor's term, just because we are facing some political headwinds. So more to come on that.
Great. All right, thank you. Well, I just have a question. I actually find this one interesting because I think when at the COP21 negotiations, I saw an incredible presence from corporations, from businesses, and I know that with the We Are Still In campaign, that there are, I think the last I heard were 1,700 businesses that have signed on to that, and so somebody asked the question, nobody specifically mentioned involvement of corporations. Were U.S. corporations present? I do know that we had Greg Downing from Target was there as part of a panel, and I know that there were others represented. Is there anybody who would like to speak to that, or people that you met from either the state of Minnesota or other businesses nationally or internationally?
Sure. Oh, go ahead.
I will say I was on a panel with Greg Downing on the second week, and so he really, I think, did a great job of, I think unofficially representing Minnesota's business community and their commitment. We are the home to, I think, 17 or 18 Fortune 500 company headquarters here in the state, and for a state our size, that is significant. And I think that goes a long way to show the commitment that those companies have, and those aren't required by any sort of mandates. They are purely done because shareholders, because customers are demanding them. That goes such a long way to help create more clean energy jobs in Minnesota and to help build that momentum and keep it going beyond what governmental requirements can do.
Great. Wonderful. Did you, Ellen,
No,
you
go
had
ahead.
something else with that? No. Okay. So given the success of carbon reductions within the utility sector in Minnesota, what are the prospects of extending that success to other sectors through either carbon taxes, cap and trade, other things that you are familiar with or maybe thinking of?
That's, now am I on? Yes. Okay, good, very good, thank you. Yeah, that's exactly where my mind was going while we're hearing everyone talking about what can we do next. And, it's kind of a mixture of hope and fear about what lies ahead. And maybe I should preface that by saying that it's incredibly inspiring to be at this conference with 20,000 some people representing every country in the world. Even Syria now joined the week that we were there. So the last holdout besides the United States. All more or less kind of paddling in the same canoe, as we talked about there, to try to make progress. And I think the most important takeaway really from the official dialogue and the official negotiations was there's a lot of detailed things that are happening in steps, but there was a very strong shared sense of urgency that more needs to happen more quickly. And so just to embellish that a tiny bit, and then I'll get to your question maybe. Because one of my other goals was to learn as much as I possibly could while I was there, learn things that I could bring back home that would be useful here. And one of the things we heard on day one was a recent report that, well, it was announced on day one at the opening remarks that UN scientists analyzed the existing commitments made by countries to the Paris Agreement, all the commitments, and said that even if every country meets their commitments, which is unknown whether they will or not. It'll only get us maybe a third of the way there. Certainly, it won't get us very far towards a 1.5 degrees Celsius limit on warming, and it'll get us closer to a 2-degree commitment by the end of the century. But we have a lot more work to do. So I think one of the most important parts of the negotiations, besides some of the details and conflicting issues that especially John talked about that are unresolved, but in terms of meeting carbon reduction goals, we have a very long ways to go. And so there was an effort to try to speed things up under the Paris schedule so that we would actually evaluate how countries are doing before 2020. And so bringing back to Minnesota that sense of urgency, I think, is something we probably all share. And we have been very successful at reducing carbon in Minnesota and increasing renewable electricity production, and that's what we've all talked about. But we have a great deal of progress that needs to be made in the areas of agriculture and transportation and heating and industrial use of energy, and also opportunities for carbon sequestration and farmland and forests, et cetera. And we have unmet goals in Minnesota, so I don't think that's been mentioned, so it's good to mention those targets that we have for greenhouse gas reduction in Minnesota that we've already slid past our 2015 goals. We have a 30% economy-wide carbon reduction or greenhouse gas reduction target by 2025 and an 80% reduction by 2050. Those are in state law. We're not on track to meet those. And that 80% reduction by 2050, when it was passed in 2007 as part of the Next Generation Energy Act, those numbers were picked because they reflected the science that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recommended to the world, that target is the minimum that we need to meet in order to stave off the worst impacts of climate change. So I'll just end by saying that's the next critically important focus, I believe, and something that I think the university can help play an important role in.
Great. Did anyone else have anything else to add with that? Great. Well, I know, John, I know your focus is education, and obviously our organization is very focused on climate change education. I think in one of your blogs you referred to it as the secret weapon. Was that it? I love that. I'm just wondering, this kind of combines a couple of different questions, but talking about the progress with climate deniers, it's a real issue, it needs to be addressed, and just wondering, with your view of climate education worldwide in the country, but obviously here in Minnesota, I know we have new science standards that for the first time include human-induced climate change that will be introduced in 2019. I just wondered if you could kind of speak to your experience a little bit and also speak to those standards.
Well, just to clarify on the standards, our review year for standards is 18-19. So we have not made a determination what our next standards are.
Okay.
Even though there is a national model out there called Next Generation Science Standards that look at that. So I know that's going to be one of the issues that will be looked at very carefully with our standards review committee, and as they're looking at that. You know, one of the things that I think people need to be kind of aware of, and I think Climate Generation is doing an especially good job on this, is that when teachers get materials that look promising, they usually don't implement them unless they've really personally experienced them. I mean, it's one of those things that we know. You get a curriculum, you put it on the shelf, and maybe you get a chance to look at that. And so, you know, one of the things that's really important is that teachers get the opportunity to experience things for themselves personally, get part of the issue, and provide the motivation to go on with that. The other thing that I saw was really kind of interesting is that the accessibility of materials or projects, now especially online, that help students get more of an international perspective, not just a Minnesota thing. One of the interesting quotes, I don't know if I can get it right, we're hoping that this first connected generation becomes the, you know, in terms of computers and things like that, also becomes the first climate aware generation that can carry that forward. And so there's a lot of neat projects with students taking a look at issues and things they're doing, and submitting those online and getting feedback from others across the world about what their experience is and what they're doing and suggestions. So there's a lot of neat things that I think we can bring back to Minnesota as ideas to carry forward.
Great, wonderful. Good. I'm going to combine a couple of these questions, and you can reflect on any of them. I'd like to hear from everybody on this one. What was either an unexpected personal reflection you had from this experience, or what is the most memorable or impactful conversation you had with someone at COP? So, Lee, do you mind if we start with you, since we haven't heard from you?
Yeah, I think, well, the most memorable conversation was not a personal conversation, but I guess I'd echo Ellen's sentiment about the Al Gore speech that we saw as probably sticking out as one of the most memorable parts. It was so current and powerful, and I mean, you couldn't help but be moved by these. He had slides from that week of the air pollution in Delhi and the harm that this was causing, and it was exacerbated by the heat and climate change. And then moving into the hopefulness and the positive forces. So for me, and I think that was like toward the end of our week there, but it really just sort of culminated my week and was probably the most memorable that I had there. Mm-hmm. I wish it had been a conversation with Al Gore, but not quite. I did shake his hand.
Good.
Well, I think I want to reflect a little bit on the atmosphere that Fiji, as the host, provided. Fiji had the chairship, and they really tried to bring that to the front. As you walked down the hall, there were pictures that were 6 feet, 8 feet high that showed people fishing and having that whole atmosphere. And so that atmosphere kind of pervaded the place, and people were always responding to what are other people thinking. And the presence of indigenous people from many countries also set that kind of mood. So it's sort of the silent conversation that was going on.
Great, thank you.
For me, it was, so where the delegation that I was with, we were staying in Cologne, so a little bit of German geography. Cologne and Bonn are not the same city. I spent a lot of time on German trains and enjoying German transit, which I think is something I would love to see a lot more of in this country. But in spending time on their transit system, you see people from all walks of life that are on the trains, and including. Since I have children that are 2 and 4, I would see lots of children, and at first it'd be like, oh, it's adorable to see toddlers speaking German, but I would see children my own age and then reflect on, the reason why I was there and think about how, in 2050, they will be around the same age that I am now, and we set all these goals based on science as far as what the world needs to look like in order to not have catastrophic effects of climate change by the year 2050 and what we need to do. And I just think about how, over the course of, the first, 3 to 4 decades of their life, what courage is it going to take from people who are in power today to be able to make sure that they are working in the clean energy jobs of the future, that they are working, that their counterparts around the world are able to survive in the places where, they are culturally, from, whether it's the islands in the Pacific or in, Africa around, around the equatorial parts of this world. So I thought a lot about future generations and what we have to do right now in order to make sure that they have the future that we all dream, certainly parents and, people all dream for them to be able to have.
Okay, thank you.
So I would add, what I really liked to bring home the most with me was kind of some pragmatic solutions. What can we do, and how can we scale up the work that's being done all the way from the local level to an international impact? And so I'm thinking about the 100% renewable energy day that I went to, an all-day meeting, and it had people from Argentina and Costa Rica and Vancouver, Canada, and Sweden, and we also heard about a very tiny Pacific Island nation that all are aspiring to and are taking steps towards producing all their energy renewably. And they all have and I left some out as well, the German government was involved as well. They all have ambitious targets, but they all have very different economies, different resources, different cultures, different geographies, so much different about them, and their challenges are unique, but so much that we could learn from each other. And so to me, that was just very, very encouraging to bring home and to think about how could we model some of those ideas here in our state and here in our region in a way that could be scalable and replicable around the country. What can we learn from other parts of the world that can help us have these really ambitious goals that help us feel like maybe we can meet that need for urgency?
Yeah.
If I can piggyback off of that for a moment, what Ellen said just reminded me of. So the state of Minnesota has for many years had a partnership with the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, which is the region of Germany where the conference was. And so, every summer we've had, exchange of Minnesotans going to Germany and Germans coming to Minnesota and trying to learn, community-wide. And this is communities from all over Minnesota, I think, went on the most recent trip. As well as legislators and other policymakers have been doing this for years. And, meeting with the wonderful folks from North Rhine-Westphalia, they are, what they expressed to us is that they said, it's like, well, we've had this partnership with Minnesota, but if we were going to look at the 50 states, we're probably the most like West Virginia. We are a state that gets 80% of our energy from coal. And for them still, it's not a political question about, acting on climate. They are working aggressively to lessen their dependence on fossil fuels, even though, they are, currently a coal-dependent state. And it was just refreshing to hear from them that this is just a commitment despite, what, we in the U.S. would hear as something like, oh, well, then they would be anti-climate action because they're such a coal state. They are, in fact, taking the opposite, and they're learning to very quickly how they can work together, as a regional government within, Germany to be able to make those changes and learning from us. And certainly Germany has been very aggressive in solar, even though they are far less sunny than Minnesota and most other states in the U.S. That was just a very encouraging and refreshing environment to be in.
Great, thank you. Well, the question, I will partially answer this question as I ask it, but the question was what percentage of Americans live in states that are still in? I know that we have 15 states. Minnesota is one of those 15 states that are still in. I believe we're the only state in the Midwest, so everybody else is mostly coastal states. Is that correct? And I don't know what percentage of Americans that is, or percentage of, also the question is percentage of carbon occurs in those states, but I don't know if that's a sense.
I don't know the exact numbers. I think there's a number floating out there about the percentage of the overall U.S. GDP represented by the states that are still in. It's significant when you think about states like California and New York, all the West Coast states, and a good portion of the mid-Atlantic states are still in addition to Minnesota and Colorado are kind of the two mid-country leaders of this. So it is a significant portion of the U.S. GDP that is part of the U.S. Climate Alliance, part of We Are Still In.
Mm-hmm. Great. Did you want to add something, Ellen?
Well, no, that's what I was going to talk about. And I just want to say it's important if you're interested in knowing about just generally where the United States is at on issues of climate change. Yale has an excellent website and program on climate change communication, and they have up-to-date polling that's very specific about different regions of the country. And it's very clear that a majority of Americans are concerned about climate change and think it's real and support an evolution, a transition to clean energy sources away from coal. And so, again, an important message not just to share abroad, but to make sure Americans know this, that there's a majority, even if they're not part of the We Are Still In coalition, they would like to see some progress being made.
Great. I appreciate that. Well, we only have just a few minutes left, so I just wondered if each of you would share a 1-minute reflection. Either two questions, because I'll combine it, so I'll let you choose. Either kind of where do you find hope looking forward, or what is something that you will do next with what you've learned from in this experience of COP23? Lee, should we start at your end?
Sure, we can start down here this time. I mean, I guess I'll answer kind of together in terms of where I find hope and what I want to do is sort of one and the same. And this goes back to one of the questions about how to do. We've had success in the utility electricity sector, and how do we have success in other sectors? I find a lot of hope in the technology and the curves that are happening right now in transportation, in particular with electric vehicles. And if the success we had in the utility sector didn't happen without policy to push it. And I think if we can have a similar kickstart in some of our other sectors of the economy, I think we can make real progress. And so that's what I'm committing myself to do, is to figure out how we can have the type of Next Generation Energy Act renewable portfolio standard that really kickstarted our electricity sector, something like that to get our other sectors going.
Great, thank you.
I think one of the areas of hope is the local actions that are going on that you alluded to and that others have alluded to. I think one of the examples came from the Minnesota panel was from the Science Museum Minnesota, in which they did a fresh look at their utilities, how much heat they were sending out of the building just because of the local operations, and how they could change that and make a big reduction and a short payback time. And I think as people get those kind of stories and realize the financial benefit from working on efficiencies and other things, that we will make a lot of progress. The other hope, I think, is the increased awareness that people are having about that it is something that we can actually make some progress on. We're not completely. One quote I heard was, "We are all sinking in the Titanic, but some of us are sinking faster." Well, I don't think it's that depressing. I think there's progress that can be made, and I hope, for my part, is to pass on some of that to our up-and-coming youth. And there was a lot of talk about helping this youth voice being presented at the conference, and it was inspiring to see the youth that were there and the passion that they had.
I think what gives me hope in Minnesota specifically, and seeing the commitment, globally, everything that's at stake, bringing it back home to, the local efforts of people in towns and cities across Minnesota and in these communities who are already realizing the benefits of the clean energy economy and watching that grow. It has nowhere to go but up. And it has such great potential, as we've already seen in a number of communities, to grow good-paying, family-supporting jobs across the state. This is when the Next Generation Energy Act passed in 2007. It was bipartisan legislation. It was signed by a Republican governor. We can do this again in Minnesota. We just need, an all-hands-on-deck sort of effort to be able to talk about the importance of why this is critical to communities across the entire state. The Environmental Quality Board does great work with the Green Step Cities program. A lot of those cities that I mentioned that have been a part of these exchanges with Germany, whether they're located in the far northwestern corner of the state where I grew up, to the metro area, to Duluth, to the Iron Range, to southwestern Minnesota. These areas all have clean energy job potential that some are already realizing that we just need to be able to develop even more in order to keep the momentum going.
Great, thanks.
So, yeah, and I'll just close with sort of piggybacking on what Stephanie said, that I'm thinking about, well, first of all, the inspiration that comes from knowing that all the countries of the world are trying to work together towards a huge challenging common goal that is so important, and that is just incredibly inspiring and helpful and sort of gives you a foundation that makes you think you can make progress. But bringing it back here, I think one of the things we can do, and in particular I'm thinking about as the university, because we're so mired in this kind of partisan divide on these issues of energy and climate change, which is completely unnecessary. And as Stephanie said, we know that it's not always been that way and it won't always be that way. But what we can do is present information and examples that go way beyond what we see as possible right now in our current political system. And you mentioned carbon pricing. I talked with a group of legislators and other experts last week about maybe we should hold a conference here or a seminar where we could bring people to the table and learn about different states and regions, say in British Columbia and other places, that are actually using carbon pricing to their advantage in their economies and making progress. And maybe we could do the same with bringing together places that are working towards 100% renewable energy. Some audacious goals that seem politically impossible when we deal with the here and the now, but in reality, if we could open people's minds and start a conversation, there's so much that's possible.
Yeah, great. Well, I know we're just a little over time, so I just wanted to say thank you so much to our panel. If we could give them a round of applause for those of you here. Thank you. I also just wanted to acknowledge, I know when John mentioned youth, we also had Audrey Arquin, who is an 8th grader who is part of our delegation, who was supposed to be on our panel today, but is homesick with a fever. So if you're listening, Audrey, I just wanted to say thank you for trying to join us. And thank you so much for all the work that you did while you were in Bonn. I know that it's a lot of effort, and we appreciate you translating that back to us today. So
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you to INE again for hosting us. There's cookies in the back for those people in the room. So thank you. Have a great day.